Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar on the new Natural Asset Management Valuation Guide for forests and tree assets. We are going to get started, even as a couple more people are trickling in. But we're very excited to share this guide with you. This guide was many years in the making. It was or is a collaborative publication between Asset Management Ontario, Credit Valley Conservation Authority, CVC, Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, so TRCA. It was also partially funded by the Greenbelt Foundation. And we have three presenters today to introduce you to the guide. I am Michelle Saka. I am an environmental scientist and a senior advisor to Asset Management Ontario. We have Joanna Cleese van Bommel, a research scientist from TRCA. And then we also have Tatiana Kvechnikova, a program manager for the Natural Assets and Ecosystem Services program at CVC. So this is a quick overview of our hour together. We're going to start with me, and I'm going to provide an introduction to asset management, natural assets, and valuation, both within asset management and more broadly. And then Joanna will walk us through the guide and provide some more insights into park and street tree valuation. And then Tatiana will cover forest valuation as well as wrap things up. And we should have some time at the end for questions. Please don't hesitate to put them in the chat at any point. I'll be keeping an eye on it, and we'll cover all your questions if we have time at the end, and then we can also follow up if needed. Now, but before we get started, we wanted to quickly touch on green infrastructure and natural assets. We called the guide a natural asset valuation guide, but the term green infrastructure is also really important. So we wanted to make sure we're all on the same page. These terms are related, but not exactly the same. And in Ontario, the regulatory context for asset management and planning uses green infrastructure as a broad umbrella term that encompasses natural assets like forests and wetlands, and enhanced assets like rain gardens and green roofs, and then also engineered assets that support stormwater management like rain barrels and permeable pavements. So for this guide, we're actually looking at a subset of assets. So the ones with trees. So that's forests, street trees, park trees, and other landscaped hedged areas. But you might see us use examples or mention green infrastructure. So we wanted to clarify that all the treed assets we're talking about do fit within the provincial definition of green infrastructure. And most folks also generally consider them to be natural assets. All right. So this is the guide. Joanna is going to share a link in the chat if you don't already have a copy. This guide is meant to support people who are tackling valuation for their treed assets in their work. We very intentionally provide step-by-step instructions for how to do it with example calculations. And that was our primary goal, to help folks, practitioners who are doing this. But we also wanted to document the different approaches being used out there with the goal of helping the sector and helping this area of practice move forward and hopefully contributing to the ultimate goal of a standardized approach being used for valuing natural assets. Now, I want to be very clear that here, when we're talking about valuation, about standardization, we're doing it with a very specific goal in mind, and that is informing asset management planning. And asset management planning is a prescribed process focused on making decisions about a municipality's collective set of assets. So its goal is to balance service levels, risks, and costs. And at its core, I think it's best explained about moving away from reactive management and really trying to move towards proactive management for infrastructure. And on the environmental side, we really want natural assets included in that process so that they're a part of decisions and so that they're not just an afterthought like they have been in the past. And part of the benefit of asset management is that it uses the same process for all assets. So you can compare and make strategic trade-offs and decisions. And when I say it's a prescribed process, there are generally 4 stages in asset management planning. The first is the state of infrastructure. So this includes inventory, condition, valuation, and risk components. The second is developing levels of service. You might have heard that terminology used. The third stage is the life cycle management. So this includes outlining all the phases of an asset's life cycle and the costs for each of those phases, and we'll talk about this more in a second. And then the final stage is the financial strategy. So how are you going to fund the required activities to meet those levels of service? So there's a little arrow on this slide. Valuation is part of that first stage, and it's essentially a number that you include in your state of infrastructure. And really, I like to think about valuation as an indicator. So in asset management, we're making decisions across all assets. But how do you compare 500 meters of pipe with 350 trees and 5 hectares of forest? That's a length, that's a count, and that's an area. They're not the same units at all. And what value does is it helps us compare assets by providing a common unit. And so that common unit is dollars. And what this means is when we then make decisions and try and understand our assets in their context of the whole municipality, we can include natural assets in those conversations about all traditional assets. So this is a list of all the asset categories in York Region's corporate asset management plan. And their valuation is a common measure in this table. And we can see forestry assets that are outlined in red there in the same table, valued the same way alongside water, wastewater, and road assets. So in traditional asset management, asset valuation is calculated using a method called current replacement value, or CRV. And this is a method the guide applies to forest and treed assets. And this method determines the asset's value based on what it would cost to replace the asset today. So if an asset is old or outdated, it isn't necessarily saying you need to replace it with the exact same one. The method really wants you to account for using modern and cost-effective materials and methods. You need to ensure the required levels of service are met, and this will become relevant later. And you should include any updated standards or regulatory requirements. So again, current replacement value, or CRV, is the focus of the methods we're presenting in this guide and in this webinar. But before we get into the details of how to apply that method, we're going to just really quickly walk through some other valuation approaches that are out there to discuss how they differ or how they may or may not apply to asset management. And first, we wanted to talk really quickly about life cycle costing. So as we saw earlier, this is a key component of asset management. It is part of that third stage. And digging into the difference between asset valuation and life cycle costs for this guide was actually more challenging than we anticipated. We thought we could look to the guidance for traditional assets like roads, and the work would really be applying it to natural assets. But there's actually not a lot of guidance out there on this topic for traditional assets either. So we spend more time than we anticipated in the guide really breaking down this difference because they are both key components to asset management. And in this graphic, each circle is a different phase of an asset's life cycle, from planning to disposal, if that's relevant. And the darker green circles are the types of costs you would include in your valuation. And the light green circles are the ones you would add to figure out the life cycle costs. So asset valuation and overall life cycle costs are not the same value, looking at the whole asset life cycle. And this is an example of what this looks like. This is a table that is in the guide. The first column of numbers is the valuation, and then the second column is the life cycle costs over 55 years. And hopefully, if you look at the bottom, it's not surprising that the life cycle costs are higher than the valuation, because the life cycle includes operations and maintenance costs over a much longer time period. So even at only $40,000 per year to maintain this forest asset over 50 years, that $40,000 does add up. And so this is the difference, and we're hoping the guide really helps articulate that and clarify areas of confusion around what to use in your current replacement value versus which data to use in your life cycle costs. Okay, so now outside of CRV and life cycle costing, there are just a couple other valuation methods for natural assets that are often considered in discussions. So that's biodiversity offsetting, land value, and ecosystem service valuation. And I'm going to touch on each one quickly and talk about their relevancy or why they don't apply for asset management valuation specifically. Starting off with biodiversity offsetting. This is when environmental impacts from development are balanced by restoring or creating habitat elsewhere to achieve ideally or theoretically a no net loss of biodiversity. On this slide, I've pulled an example from the City of Barrie's ecological offsetting policy. And these types of policies typically use a similar approach to the one we recommend in the guide and can inform your CRV calculations. TRCA's compensation guideline was actually used to inform some of the methods in this guide over the years. So essentially, if your municipality has a biodiversity offsetting policy, it can be a great place to start and consider in your CRV methodology. But that said, most municipalities don't have this type of policy. So we definitely don't assume you have one to use the methods in this guide. It's mainly to flag that if you do have one, you might want to look at that and apply perhaps a consistent methodology between the different approaches. Okay, the next valuation people sometimes consider, especially in the context of natural assets, is land value. Now, this is something that could be relevant to any type of asset. Most assets, are built on land of some type. And it's really important to note that it is not included, land value is not included in traditional asset current replacement cost valuations. And I think the biggest reason is that land is typically valued by market value, and this is a pretty volatile measure. So it can go up and down significantly, and that would impact your valuation year by year in pretty meaningful ways, and not in ways that are helpful for making practical decisions about your assets. And then even more relevant for natural assets, there is zoning variability that impacts valuations. So what this means is that the value of land with restricted use, such as like protected areas or parks, is the market value is generally much lower than land zoned for development. So if we were to use this in our valuation, this would also significantly undervalue protected natural assets. And so it's not something we want to use in valuation because it's not done for other assets and because I don't think it will help accurately value your natural features. Okay, so this is the final valuation approach we're going to look at because it does come up fairly frequently, and this is ecosystem service valuation. This is the economic valuation of natural assets. So usually used for making the business case for protection or restoration of natural assets, especially in the context of development decisions. It values the services provided by those assets. So this is what the types of metrics this looks at. So stormwater costs, avoided healthcare costs, property value increases. And again, these are economic valuations of the services provided, and they can be really useful for the business case, but they are not what we want to use within our asset management valuation. And that's mainly because traditional assets, we're not valuing their services. You know, we aren't measuring the avoided healthcare costs of clean drinking water pipes or the flood damage costs avoided by stormwater sewer systems. The real benefit of integrating natural assets into asset management is that we're using consistent approaches. So we need to use the same method for all assets. And so, yeah, I think that's enough about what not to do. Let's dig into how to use that method, current replacement value, to value your natural assets with trees in the context of asset management. I'll hand it over to Joanna.
Thanks, Michelle. So I wanted to start off my section with this slide of the guide's table of contents. Now you have a link to the guide in the chat, but I thought it'd be useful to highlight what we're going to cover today and what you may wish to explore further yourself. So to situate you within the guide, Michelle just covered the sections 1 and 2, the introduction and asset valuation. And I find these are really good references to return to when you're cementing your understanding of the purpose of asset management valuation and those differences with other common valuation approaches. We're now moving into the step-by-step guidance. I'll begin with street and park trees, defining what we mean by those, what a general formula for valuation looks like, the unit costs you need for calculation, and a few different approaches with our recommendation. Tatiana will then do the same for forest assets and summarize opportunities for advancement in the field. Some other elements of the guide that we don't have time for today, but that you can explore, is a separate section on hedges and patches, which is very similar, but just detailed for clarity. In section 4, you can see how to apply these principles generally to non-treed natural assets. There's a section for other consideration, and then a few appendices, including further information on ecosystem service valuation, if you're curious. But for street and park trees, these are the individual trees that you see along roads and in parks. Some are purposely planted. They're surrounded by mulch or other evidence of human intervention. Some can be naturally seeded. They're found in both urban and rural contexts, and it's typically obvious that they're a lone or a single asset rather than part of a patch or a forest because of the distance between them and other trees. Street and park trees are so important for the livability of our urban and rural environments. If you're in the GTA right now, you might have noticed that we're experiencing an incredibly seasonally warm couple of days, and I really appreciated the trees blocking the sun on my walk into work today. They also improve air quality, they reduce stormwater runoff, and mitigate climate change by storing and sequestering carbon. But because of their isolation and their exposure to stressors like urban air pollution, physical damage, and road salt, these trees often require more intensive management and maintenance than forests. But unlike forests, and similar to gray infrastructure, street and park trees do have an expected end of life when they'll need to be replaced. So because of this, they're sometimes classified as enhanced green infrastructure instead of natural green infrastructure. But as Michelle mentioned, they're included in this guide because they are frequently included in natural asset management plans. They are living assets, and they're really commonly found on municipal and CA lands, which are the main folks doing asset management planning. For many organizations, including the municipalities that we began working with on natural asset management planning at TRCA, individual trees were the first natural asset to be integrated into asset management plans. And when deciding on the best valuation approach, we started to develop a few guiding principles. So the first is to be efficient. When you're going out to collect tree inventory data, consider what data you need to collect to use different valuation approaches. Or if you're trying to use existing data, the reverse of this is to pick the approach that uses what you have available through your inventory, as you'll see later on. Next, the value calculation method needs to be feasible, replicable, and establish a process for regular updates. The idea here is not to make it too complex. This is not the time for intensive modeling. It should be something that is easy to calculate and easy to explain. And a part of that goal of making something easy to explain, it's really important that you ensure alignment with your organization's approaches for gray infrastructure. Otherwise, you can't do that apples to apples comparison. That's the real value of valuation. Lastly, I do want to acknowledge that new and better information can emerge, and this can impact your value estimates. But asset management planning is all about continuous improvement, so that's to be expected and allowed for. So as Michelle explained, current replacement value is an asset's value based on the total cost to replace it today. A simplified way to think of this for individual trees across an asset portfolio is current replacement value calculated as the tree unit cost times the total number of trees. And that total number of the unit cost is comprised of three elements: the tree price, or the average nursery cost for a caliper-sized tree, installation cost, including any planting labor, transportation, design, and shipping, and finally, the establishment costs. So that's initial mulching and watering. We assumed a 2-year warranty period and 1 additional year, but you should edit the establishment time horizon to match the practices done at your own organization. You will notice that we did not include any tree or stump removal in this calculation, and that's because for gray infrastructure, the cost to remove an asset is not commonly included in the value. So when you have an old pipe, you don't include the cost to remove it before you replace it with a new pipe. However, some municipalities and CAs do include removal costs for gray infrastructure, so you should check what is standard practice at your organization and follow suit for consistency. Now, the costs that you plug into valuation are really what drive the value and are essential to accurately reflect the replacement value of those assets. So we want you to be as locally and organizationally specific as possible. Ideally, this means you're pulling costs from local practices, prices from previous tender, costs from contracts. But if you don't plant trees or you haven't done so recently, looking to a neighboring municipality or CA is the next best thing. Additionally, for tree prices, you can also explore local tree nursery costs. And we also link in the guide to the International Society of Arboriculture Ontario's Ontario Supplement cost table. This supplement has average wholesale prices of different commonly planted and occurring tree species from across Ontario based on 2021 catalog prices. So with this and any other prices that you use, it's really important that you're inflating them to the current year to be accurate. Now, depending on the data that you have about the trees in your tree inventory, you can either set unit cost by each species, or you can develop an average based on common tree species. And there's some more information about different options available in the guide. The one other difference between natural assets and gray infrastructure that I want to highlight is around accounting for age. So the current replacement value assumes that the replacement is delivering the same services, a like-for-like replacement. For built assets, this might happen immediately. The new pipe is doing what the old pipe was doing, but natural assets, as we know, take time to establish. If you think of a 50-year-old tree with a huge trunk and a large canopy, it's providing services that cannot be replaced by putting in a small sapling. So the recommended approach to deal with this is to account for the age or size of the asset by using a multiplier to increase the replacement cost of a mature asset. So that way you're estimating the cost of replacing a single mature tree with multiple small trees. There's 2 common multipliers that are used to account for replacing a large tree with small trees. That's the tree diameter or the basal area. And for both, the basic data collection required is the same. It's diameter at breast height, or DBH, which is a very standard measurement in forestry and might already be part of your inventory. If you don't have this information, the guide also provides information on simple one-to-one replacement. But if you do have DBH, then you can pick which one of these makes the most sense. Trunk diameter assumes that one tree is replaced with the number of small trees that would have the same diameter, and basal area requires the number of replacement trees to be equivalent in basal area. So the example that we have here and in the guide, a tree with a DBH of 20 centimeters would theoretically be replaced by 4 5-centimeter trees using trunk diameter, or 16 trees using trunk basal area. And so I'm going to compare the trunk diameter and basal area approaches with one other size-based method that you might be familiar with. Because natural asset management planning is still an emerging field, and the question of valuing trees came up not so long ago, the original instinct was to use existing standards like the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraiser, or CTLA, trunk formula. This is a method that was created to assign a defensible monetary value to trees for insurance, legal purposes, taxes, and real estate assessments. Like the basal area method, CTLA assumes that one tree is replaced by several others, replacing the basal area of the tree. However, CTLA depreciates the value of the tree based on its location, functionality, and condition. And this fundamentally does not align with the approach taken for green infrastructure, or gray infrastructure. A broken pipe needs to be replaced with a new functional pipe, and so the replacement value is the value of the functional pipe. Condition, as you saw earlier, is a separate piece of asset management planning that helps direct management where it's most needed and not included here. So if we think back to our guiding principles of asset management valuation, using CTLA is not an apples to apples comparison with gray infrastructure, and it's also not simple and efficient. It requires very detailed information on each tree's location, the species, condition, and even external factors like the presence of salt. We find that this is quite labor and cost intensive, especially to do at a full asset portfolio stage. So that brings us back to the diameter and basal area options. Both of these methods only require DBH and the unit cost per tree. The difference here is that trees grow exponentially, and so does basal area. So this is better correlated with true size, and therefore what we recommend in the guide. I do want to flag two things, though, with basal area. The first is that it can lead to very high valuation numbers, which some can find challenging to justify. And secondly, there are some cases, for instance, if you have a plantation prior to thinning, where the basal area can drop suddenly after thinning, which affects valuation from one asset management plan to the next. But because we allow for change over the course of an iterative asset management planning process, this is still a recommended approach. Since accounting for size and age is the main difference between the methods outlined in the guide, we do include a comparison showing the results for different sizes of tree. We also have really specific calculation examples walking through how we got these numbers, so you can look at how that was generated in greater detail. But at a high level, you can see that for small 5-centimeter trees, the results are very similar through the 3 size-based approaches and the one-to-one replacement. In this case, CTLA actually has the highest condition for small trees, or the highest value for small trees, because it's assuming excellent condition. As you go up to 10 centimeter, all 3 of the size-based approaches have an increase in value, with basal area increasing the most. And then as you get up to large 30 and 50 centimeter trees, that's when basal area can jump and show a really high value. But I don't want you to necessarily think of that as a negative or something that's hard to explain. I want you to think about a very large tree, all of the benefits that it's providing, and the long time it took for it to grow to that size. If it were to be lost and replanted with a 5-centimeter caliper tree, it's going to take an incredibly long time to get back to what once was, which is why you want to include that multiplier in the valuation to reflect the value of what it is on the land right now. It's very important to capture that in asset management planning as it guides decision making. And as a reminder, these are not life cycle costs. We're not committing to paying that much to replace the large tree. We're just trying to estimate its current value. And so to summarize this section, if we think back to our guiding principles, it's important that the method we choose is efficient, not too complex, and an apples to apples comparison with gray infrastructure. So we don't recommend CTLA. Of the remaining options, asset management planning is built around service delivery. So it's really important that the method we choose accounts for the tree size and age. So we don't recommend one-to-one if you have DBH data available. And between diameter and basal area does have that better correlation with tree size and therefore is our recommended approach. However, that final guiding principle is continuous improvement. So if you don't have the data for basal area, if you've used CTLA in the past, or if diameter is what's been approved by decision makers at your organization, then there's always a chance to evolve in future iterations. And with that, I'll pass it over to Tatiana to walk you through how to do the same for forests.
Thank you, Joanna. Good afternoon, everyone. And the concluding part of the presentation, I will be talking about evaluation approaches for forest, as Joanna said. And before I go into detail on the specific approaches, I would like to identify what the forests are or what was included in our evaluation guide. We included the following: treat communities, essentially any aquatic or wetland or terrestrial ecosystem with the canopy cover greater than 25%. Woodlands, terrestrial tree community with canopy cover ranging from 35 to 60%, and forest, terrestrial tree communities with canopy cover larger than 60%. So similar to trees, for the forest valuation, we use a carrot replacement value, which is identified as afforestation or reforestation cost per hectare multiplied by the area of the forest asset. So before, again, going into more detail on the approach for forest valuation, as you notice in this formula, we could use potentially either afforestation cost per hectare or restoration cost per hectare. And there's quite often confusion between these two terms. Sometimes they use interchangeably, sometimes they mean different things. So we really try to identify in the guide what each of them means. For afforestation, approach assumes that actually we are creating a forest from scratch and trees are being planted in a site where there was no trees before. For example, abandoned agricultural lands. And similar to for the restoration cost, we actually assume that we enhancing existing forested ecosystem by planting trees or doing some other management, undertaking some other management actions. So for the purpose of the guide, we recommend focusing on afforestation because it's similar and more consistent with the approach used for gray infrastructure assets. So you're actually replacing the infrastructure with a new, let's say, an old pipe at the end of its life with a new pipe. So it's really creating or developing a new feature, not new asset, rather than just restoring the existing one. However, that's being said, we fully understand that afforestation costs not necessarily always available, and in this case, using restoration cost per hectare is perfectly fine. In other cases, some ecosystem features or assets, for example, some types of wetlands, cannot be really created with a reasonable measure of success. And in this case, again, restoration cost per unit area is recommended for such features. But for the purpose of the guide, we're focusing on afforestation approach. And for the forest valuation, there are generally two main options that we've identified in the guidance. Afforestation cost method, which is again based on carrot replacement value calculations, which is identified as afforestation cost per hectare multiplied by asset area. And option two, the same kind of base afforestation cost method, but with using multipliers. So in addition, it's also multiplied by a certain multiplier that accounts for the age. Just bring in the taking into account that the larger, more mature forests provide more services at higher levels of services than newly planted trees. And I will go into more detail in the next slides to talk about multipliers and how they're calculated. So obviously there are slight differences in terms of effort and the data requirements for a forestation cost method. For forestation cost method, you have to calculate the you have to know the forest area in hectares and also a forestation cost rate. For the forestation cost with basal area multiplier, you would need to know the stand basal area. And again, I will show in later slides how it's all calculated. In terms of the pros and cons, obviously the forestation cost method is a standard approach that consistent with the approach used for gray infrastructure. It's simple to calculate. Its replacement cost is represent the cost of creating an asset of the same size, which is again compatible with the method used for gray infrastructure. However, it doesn't really account for age, and again, assuming that a young forest would provide the same level of service as mature forest, as potential undervaluing the current feature, the current asset. And in case of forestation cost with basal area multiplier, by using the multiplier, we partially account for forest age, and stand basal area can be assessed objectively, quickly, and cost effectively. For example, most commonly used method is a wedge prism used by foresters, but it's obviously more expensive and time-consuming, resource-consuming, more steps to apply, more data to collect. And even if we use a basal area as a proxy for forest age, size of trees in the forest, as well as functions and condition, it's really not a perfect indicator of forest structure and function. And the quality of the species that we have in a particular forest is not really directly accounted for. And there's some management activities that can potentially affect a basal area suddenly and cause drop in value as well. For example, thinning in plantations. So the first step before you even when you have to calculate the unit cost per a hectare of forest, you have to decide on a forestation approach. And there are two general forestation approaches, traditional versus enhanced. Traditional, used for larger areas, usually using a tractor to plant predominantly coniferous species. And it doesn't really aim at creating a naturalized forest from the beginning. Rather, it aims at mimicking certain forest functions, for example, serving as wind protection or providing shading. So over time, it may become natural forest with additional management activities such as thinning, understory planting, to mention a few, but it will take longer and will require more expensive management practices in the longer term. But in the shorter term, it's definitely less expensive than enhanced afforestation, and it's quick to start. It doesn't require much in terms of the site preparation or aftercare. In terms of the cons, I mentioned that it takes longer to start providing the same services as a natural forest. And also because of the low diversity of species being planted, it's more susceptible to pests and diseases. In terms of enhanced infrastructure, in terms of enhanced afforestation, we initially plant a greater diversity of species, and usually done by hand and in various densities, patterns. It also includes adding some habitat structures, and obviously pros is from the beginning what has been created a natural forest that provide variety of services. It's potentially more resilient to disease and pests because of the greater biodiversity. And potentially, you also can save on maintenance management cost in the longer term, because as I mentioned, in case of traditional, if you want it to eventually become natural forest, more management and maintenance activities would be required over long term. And cons, of course, it's much more expensive and resource consuming than the traditional approach. In terms of when we calculate the cost of afforestation per hectare, we need to start with identifying activities that would be included and would be costed out. This is an example from the traditional forestation, but similar activities can be identified and costed out for enhanced afforestation as well. So similar to the trees, and Michelle also mentioned on her slide for the life cycle, how is it different from current from replacement cost value from replacement value. We are looking at the range of activities from the early stages of planning up to the establishment of the asset, in this case, forest. So we include general admin project management activities related to project initiation, planning, execution, planning and design activities, site preparation, actual planting, and first initial monitoring and maintenance activities for at least 3 to 5 years after planting. And establishment activities that would include follow-up, infill planting, and competition control. And this is an example. You can find it in the guide with explanation, more detail on how it was calculated. This is based on TRC restoration typicals, the costs for restoration activities, and just simply to show you the difference between the cost that would per hectare, hypothetical hectare, if traditional coniferous afforestation is used versus enhanced afforestation planting. So as you can see, it's obviously enhanced afforestation is more expensive. However, as I mentioned, is much more beneficial from ecological and economic perspective in the long term. Now, if we want to apply and multiply to account for the structure and structure and function of the mature forest, like with individual trees, where data exists, we want to account for age. For forest, basal area in a multiplier used. So stem basal area is the cross-sectional area of the stems in forest, measured at the breast height, 1.3 meter. So it's expressed as a unit area of land, square meters per hectare. So it provides a measure of stand density and helps assess forest health in general. And it's a common way to describe stand density and indicates how much of the growing space it's actually taking up. So if for current replacement case value with a multiplier, it's just the key assumption is that mature forest assumed to have larger basal area than younger forest, and mature forests obviously provide a high level of services and more services than younger forests. So, and there's certain assumptions that would need to be made for applying the multiplier. So this is based on the TRC compensation guidelines for ecosystems compensation. And the guideline was developed specifically to calculate how much it would sorry. The guideline was developed to specify a method for replacing ecosystems that would be lost due to development or infrastructure projects. And one of the key assumptions that probably would be a bit challenging to grasp is the assumption was that all restoration projects would need to be completed within a 10-year period. And based on TRC restoration data, it is typical to achieve a stand basal area of 5 square meters per hectare within the 10 years of afforestation. So this is pretty much what the second column show. Therefore, forest on impacted sites, we assume that if stand basal area more than 5 meter per square meter per hectare, they would require a larger area of land to ensure that the total basal area is equivalent within the 10 years. So this is the formula you can use for the multiplier. It's essentially we recommended continuous value that would be applied. So you divide the average stand basal area for particular forested assets by 5 square meter per hectare, which is again a basal area of 10-year-old restoration site. And just an example, you can see for a 10 basal area, 10 square meter per hectare, you have this multiply of 2, but for 12, you have 2.4. And using this continuous value based on this formula is beneficial because it allows us to avoid large jumps as in actual multiply and therefore in the value. As forests become more mature and the coefficients, the multiplier keeps growing. And I think this is all I have for the forest valuation. And the key takeaways, there are a few. If possible, we recommend consider valuation approach before collecting inventory data to capture all inputs necessary for the valuation. For example, if you entertain the idea of applying multiplier to account for the forest age, then you would need to collect information or data on DBH and forest basal area. It also makes sense to apply a straightforward valuation approach that reflects size age where possible, but accounting for age can be also an area of improvement if data are not allowed currently for doing that. Valuation for natural assets should also be aligned with the approach used for great traditional infrastructure to ensure consistency and that we can compare a level of investments among different classes and have a proper financial strategy estimates among different classes of assets. And those are key takeaways. And the only slide that I have remaining is opportunities for advancement. We put lots of thought in developing this guide and really appreciate your feedback and hopefully you'll find it very valuable and useful. However, there are definitely some opportunities for advancing it even further. One of them is to develop standardized guidelines and building on report's findings, we feel there's a need to work towards developing standardized methods that would be uniformly applied by different organizations, municipalities, conservation authorities. So the key step would be to convene relevant stakeholders and including asset management organizations and having this conversation, potential methods at what could be eventually become a golden standard for specific valuation for forested assets. The second opportunity for advancement is definitely creating a detailed valuation guide on the natural asset types. We have a section 4 in this guide that kind of hinted on how potentially valuation could be done for other natural assets, including wetlands. However, we're hoping at some point to develop equally detailed valuation guide for all other natural asset types. The third area of advancement, collaboration on the approach for invaluable assets. So by invaluable assets, we mean assets that cannot be really replaced. The unique ecosystems that we want to create a guidance how to deal with this and how they would fit in the asset management process. Developing tools, obviously, another area of advancement. We would like to continue collaborating with asset management leaders to develop and refine existing tools, templates that can assist in the valuation of natural assets. And last but not least, conducting training. So we're doing this webinar as an introduction into a guide. However, we're hoping there will be many more opportunities to present and to participate in training on this topic. And stay tuned. We're hoping to have at some point training, more detailed training on the guidance with specific calculation examples for treat assets. With that, I'm just going to open the floor for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Tatiana. Thanks, Joanna. We, as Tatiana mentioned at the end there, we didn't have time really to get into the step-by-step calculations when you break it down into an hour. It is all included in the guide, and that was really important for us to include in there. But we are also hoping to put together some training to walk through the detailed calculations focused on unit costs, in part because that was something, as we wrote the guide, we realized there was very little guidance on, and we had to do a lot of learning as we went, and really, as Joanna mentioned, like drive the overall valuation. So it is a really big piece of the overall equation. All right, so we have some questions here. A question about sharing the slides. Yeah, I think we can do that. Again, I'm pretty sure every graphic we pulled is in the guide itself, but happy to share the slide deck as well with folks on the call. And then Marina had a question around the applicability of CRV to the financial strategy. So if we're using, 4 trees or 6 trees, small trees replacing one large tree, how applicable is the CRV in the long-term financial planning? Joanna, do you want to tackle that one?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it. Yeah, so I think this is a really important clarifying point, that there's a reason the valuation is separate from the life cycle costing, the financial strategy, especially with these natural assets where we're adding the multiplier. It's not necessarily a direct line of those costs into the life cycle costs. I think especially when you imagine a street or park tree, you don't actually necessarily want to replace your 1 street tree with 6. It might run out of space pretty quickly. So it's really accounting for the value of what you have now at this stage of asset management planning, and later down the line when you're thinking about replacing that asset, only budgeting for the replacement of 1 tree. Or if you have another standard, you can consider that. For the most part, it is 1-to-1 in life cycle and financial planning.
Yeah, great point. Though if you do have an offsetting policy, or if your municipality does do a 4-to-1, whatever you actually do on the ground, that should be what's reflected in your financial strategy for sure. Okay, so is there a standard approach to evaluate how many trees would be needed to replace annually for various types of trees? So I guess I can answer this really quickly. The guide isn't a planting plan or a planting policy. It's really about focusing in on the detailed calculations for how to value what is existing on your landscape. Those are all really good questions and need to be tackled in the context of asset management planning in later stages. But the valuation approach isn't really intended to inform that. Those are management and policy decisions. Joanna, Tatiana, anything to add to that?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay. Brent, is there a plan to share these materials with the CanMug meeting, which is coming up in early June? Can't say we've heard of that, the Canadian Maximo user group, but we're happy to share. So if there is a really useful opportunity for us to present this guide to other audiences, let us know. We'll put our emails in the chat, and please don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, trunk diameter replacement cost feels too small and basal area replacement feels too large. Would taking an average of the 2 costs feel more accurate? Oh, yes. So we've had a lot of discussions about this and totally agree in general. What I will say is that both are good methods. And this is where our #1 recommendation is this need for standardization. Because we did want to make a recommendation in the guide, but it's just 3 organizations, and I think there needs to be like broader conversations to move towards a fully standardized approach. That said, and TRCA has been test piloting the basal area replacement method. I think CBC has too, and it is a huge difference when you get into 50-centimeter trees, but there tend to be not that many in a municipality, especially outside of forests, and we're talking about street trees and park trees. And so while it does feel like it could be too large, in practicality, a lot of your trees are going to be on the smaller side where the valuations are very similar. And those huge trees really, I think, are that valuable. So when you dig into it, I was a little bit of a skeptic about the basal area replacement method as well, but when you apply it in practice, there are so few trees that are that big that I think it can be pretty accurate to the value. But that said, I do think there still need to be conversations, because municipalities have definitely used diameter, and it is a good method as well. Joanna, Tatiana, anything to add to that?
You nailed it.
Okay, do you have any plan to organize any training sessions for all the details of the calculations? Yes, we would love to do that. Right now, we're just trying to figure out where to get some money, some funding to support that kind of work, but we would really love to do detailed training on these calculations. Okay. Can you take tree condition into account and use that as a modifier for the replacement cost? So yeah, this is an interesting point, Bradley. So I will say on my end, that's what CTLA does. Essentially, you're depreciating the value based on condition, and it's really tempting, but the condition, as Joanna mentioned, is a separate piece and a separate factor in the overall asset management process. So you really do a disservice to those natural assets if you're depreciating them before they get into those broader decision-making metrics. Joanna, Tatiana, anything to add?
Yeah, I also think the condition changes too much to be a reliable modifier. So I think having it as its own section allows that not to affect. And obviously the comparison to gray infrastructure is important, but another factor to consider.
How do you deal with disease situations like ash beetle struck before or after there was another similar infestation? Yeah, Joanna, Tatiana, do you want to tackle this? We have a whole section on dead trees because that was an interesting one that you really do need to think through if there's dead trees popping up in your inventory.
Take that. Yeah, so we do include dead trees in the inventory in our valuation. I think the idea again is that apples to apples comparison to gray infrastructure. So you include a broken pipe in your inventory and valuation. For gray infrastructure, you include a dead tree for natural assets. Again, this is where it's really important to have condition as its separate bucket, and it'll be flagged in that category as dead or dying, and the associated management implications.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if you're planning to replace, which most street and park trees especially, you would be replacing. And so really, what are the costs to replacing that tree if it were still alive? Okay, one more question. I recall there was a requirement to plant 2 trees if you remove 1 mature tree. This was a TRCA requirement a long time ago. Does this requirement still stand? Joanna.
That's actually a great question. I don't know that I know that. Do you remember that from your days here, Michelle?
I don't remember a specific 2-to-1. It might have been before so we mentioned the compensation policy, and before that was officially board approved, I think there might have been a general 2-to-1 approach, but I do believe the compensation or biodiversity offsetting policy is driving those requirements now. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Again, our emails, somewhere in the chat, Joanna added them. Reach out. We're happy to hear from everyone about this topic, and we're really hoping this is just kickstarting a conversation about moving towards standardization for all these methods. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.